Center for Women's Global Leadership and the Feminist Advocacy for Women's Rights through the United Nations class. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to hear from three very exciting activists, to learn about their work, to learn about their journey. I think it'll be a wonderful afternoon for all of us. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you so you can hear firsthand, not filtered through whatever. But it's going to be exciting. So here we go.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming inside rather than staying outside on like the first sunny day in 9 years. We really appreciate it. Well, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be back here. I'm an alum of this panel, thanks to Elmira and Radhika, and I think I've been here for 4 years now or something. So it's like I've seen you start as freshmen and now blossom into seniors. Anyway, so I'm happy to be here. I'll tell you a little bit about my organization, a little bit about me, a little bit more about my organization, and then I'll pass it along to these guys, and then we will have plenty of time for Q&A. How's that sound? Good. Okay, so first of all, I'll be offended if you don't have your phones out. So do have your phones out, because I'm hoping you're going to be tweeting everything we say. I think we will welcome that. And not everything, some things. So I'm hoping that maybe each of us, when we start talking, can make sure you have the Twitter handles for our organization, so that you can follow us and also tweet where you are right now if you feel like it, and also sign up for the emails from our organization. So to get that rolling, so Breakthrough, which I'll tell you more about, is @Breakthrough. That's it, on Twitter. And my personal handle is, we use social media in my organization, so that's why I'm leading with this. My personal handle is Harris Lynn, HARRISLYNN. And our US website, if you're inspired to sign up for our emails, our newly launched, it's actually sort of still even in soft launch, so this is sort of even a sneak peek for you guys. Our newly launched US website is us.breakthrough.tv. And it's super easy to sign up for our emails there, again, if you're inspired. And again, I hope you'll follow all of us on all of the things. Anyway, so I am a Vice President for Communications for Breakthrough. We are a global human rights organization. Our particular focus is that we work to make gender-based violence, violence against women, discrimination against women and girls, unacceptable. So what that means, the keyword there is, there are many keywords, but one of the keywords is unacceptable. And that means what we work to do is drive culture change. We work to make all of those things I listed not okay, not cool, weird, not done, the outlier, as opposed to the norm. So we do that by challenging the norms that make violence okay, the norms around victim blaming, the norms around gender that put us on, that set up expectations of how men are supposed to be and how women are supposed to be, and maybe leave out a whole lot of people in between. And how do we change norms? We get people to change norms. We get institutions to change norms. So rather than working in the, we work with and around traditional human rights spaces, but our focus is people. Our focus is getting people active, getting people to think, to not think, and this is especially an issue in the US, to not think about human rights as something in a faraway place, and oppression in far-off lands, but as human rights, but to think of human rights as a very present and urgent set of issues here in the United States, and not just issues again that affect other people that you study in your classes, but issues that affect all of us every day, and issues that we can address by bringing human rights values into our interactions with people. Everyone in this room can treat all the people around them with dignity and equality and justice. And if we did that, all of us, every day, even in our little interactions, that would lead to a whole lot of people treating all the people around them with dignity and equality and justice. And that's how we can create a culture of human in the United States, and a culture that makes discrimination and violence and rigid gender norms and all of those things unacceptable. So in a few minutes, I'll tell you a little bit more about how we do that. But a lot of, I think, the inquiry today is how we came to be doing these things. So my personal story has actually very little drama, but I think also it will be. I hope that it will be helpful and perhaps even a little inspiring to you, because I think the theme of it is that you can actually get paid for doing stuff that you believe in and that is fun. Didn't say you could get rich. Did say you could get paid. And I think the other important piece of my story, no spoilers, but I think the other important piece is that there's no one path to being a professional activist. There's the skills that you may develop in other contexts apply to activism. The skills that you develop doing activism apply to other contexts. So it's really all about how you live your life and what skills you develop in all parts of your life, and seeing how you can apply those skills to a career in activism where you get paid for the activism. Anyway, so just my own story is, I don't really know how I came, I didn't have like a one big, Diana and I were talking about this in the train, I didn't have one big aha moment around feminism or any related issue. The only one I can think of is just remembering, like, in 3rd grade in Massachusetts, no, not even, like, first grade in Massachusetts, our gym teacher, and this was, I guess, this was the 70s, and our gym teacher said, okay, here's how you do push-ups, and here's how you do girl push-ups. And I remember just thinking, that, I can't put my finger on it, but that ain't right. And again, not the only aha moment or even a big one, but I just remember that when, as a little kid, being like, Mr. Cargill, so my parents were both, feminism and activism were not a rebellion for me at all. On one side of my family is a long line of socialists, and I was never rebelling against my parents when I, started volunteering at did pro-choice stuff in college in the 80s, and I was the PR person the vice president for public relations for the Boston chapter of the National Organization for Women in the early 90s as a volunteer. We had beepers, just to date that for you a little bit. We had beepers and a daisy wheel printer, it's sort of like a typewriter, and a computer the size of this room. And we ran a really great press operation where the reporters in Boston that we worked with we didn't make it a secret, but they didn't know we were volunteers because we worked so hard to reframe stories, to get out there on stories. So I really got a lot of my, it was activism, and I didn't get paid, but I got a lot of my skills that way at the very, very beginning, early on. And I actually started out, long story short, I started out as a journalist. And when you start out as a journalist, you don't start out necessarily writing about the stuff that you care about. That's not a bad thing, that's just how it is, or at least that's how it was in, however many years ago, more than 20, when there weren't you didn't have blogs, you didn't have places where you could practice writing about your own stuff. There were no other venues I guess there were zines, but that was a little bit later. But it was just a time when you learned how to be a journalist. And once again, that's not a bad thing. That is where I learned how to be a journalist. That is where I learned how to write to length. That is where I learned how to report. That is where I learned how to fact check. That is where I learned how to write a certain way for one publication that's appropriate to that publication, and write a certain way to another publication that's appropriate to that publication. And so, flagging what I said was a theme of the story, that's a really important skill. Even if you're writing something you couldn't care less about, doesn't matter. You're learning messaging. You're learning branding. You're learning how to talk to one audience a certain way and say the same exact thing to a different audience in a totally different way. So I'm telling you now, stuff that you're learning now, whether it feels like activism, probably is very relevant. Eventually I was able to write about what I wanted to write about, in addition to whatever else. And eventually what I wanted to write about also wound up being able to be what I really got paid to write about, because I stuck with it for so long that I was able to be part of the first Salon. Several years ago, we were one of the first, when I was writing for Salon, we were one of the first news organizations to launch a women's issues blog that was about women's stuff but didn't pull all the women's stuff off the rest of the news site, if that makes any sense. It didn't silo the women's issues so much as highlight the women's issues. And I was involved in the strategy of developing that. I wrote a lot about women's stuff and feminism and all sorts of other social justice things for magazines like Glamour, which actually had historically been the most progressive of the women's magazines, which pretty much all of them were a lot more progressive than people thought. And that was really all of these experiences working for mainstream media and as well as non-mainstream media solidified a conviction I'd always had, which was, how can we change the mainstream? How can we work within the mainstream to change the mainstream? You could write for lefty zines all day long, and that is a great thing to do, and I am not minimizing that in any way. But another thing you can do at the same time to make a different kind of change is work with the mainstream culture and try to change the mainstream use the mainstream culture to change the mainstream culture. Because how many people are you reaching at that time? And how are you thinking about how do I reach an audience that doesn't use the same jargon that I do at my now meetings? And how do I reframe the issue to get more and more and more people interested and involved? And how do I reframe this issue to make it relevant to gajillions of people at once? And that's the power of working in the mainstream. And so, I did a few other related and relevant things, such as my creative partner and I created a superhero called Breakup Girl, who helps people with romantic emergencies. And the idea was that she helped using a superhero character and using the gestalt of comics and kind of that whole geek space to change the way people talk about relationships, to make it not this place where women talk to men, that kind of. First of all, it wasn't only women talking about men at all. It was a totally co-ed site. We talked about gay issues, we talked about trans issues, we talked about age, we talked about race, we talked about all these different things in this very appealing mainstream guise of the superhero world and all of our superhero friends. And we did animations, and we did a device column, and we did all these things. So again, the idea of culture, using cultural artifacts to drive cultural change, using pop culture to drive change. And so 4 or 5 years ago, when I was, for many reasons, ready to leave journalism, partly just because I've been doing it for so long, I thought to myself, it is very important to me to stay in this space of culture change and pop culture for change. And that is really, and it's not just because I really, really love television, although that is the main reason. But I really believe that. I mean, it was such a big deal, you guys. How many years ago was it when, and I'm using all these old references to make a point, when Ellen DeGeneres came out on her sitcom, it was such a big deal. I cannot tell you what a big deal it was, and I cannot tell you it didn't change everything, but it unlocked the possibility of everything changing. And it is just, there is so much power there. And so I thought to myself, if I want to leave journalism, how can I sort of portage my skills over to something where I can use pop culture and storytelling and working with mainstream to drive change? That will never happen. That's too perfect. That's there's no such thing. I'm not going to be able to do that. I'm just going to have to go to med school or something. And then it turned out that there was this organization called Breakthrough that uses culture to change culture for human rights. And at the time, they were looking for a communications person. And the friend who told me about the job was involved in the search. So, in other words, she was helping them find someone. So it was a little bit magical. So, you know, as I often say, things definitely fall into your lap, but you do have to make sure your lap is somewhere near the right place. It's not that I didn't work for it, and it's not that I haven't worked out very hard since, but I got very lucky with my timing. And Breakthrough is willing to take a chance on me, even though I was hired as communication strategist. I had never actually done a job where I had the title communication strategist before, or a job where I had the title that had the word communications or strategist in it. But as I was saying before, I knew I didn't call it messaging and branding, but I had done it 100 times, a million times in journalism and in the context of Breakup Girl. I knew how to write. I knew how to write for different audiences. I knew how to do audience engagement because I had done it with Break. We had a huge website with different content every day. I'd done all that content development. I'd done all that stuff. I just didn't call it what I was about to start calling it. And so I've been at Breakthrough for the last, actually LinkedIn just told me it's my 4th work anniversary. So I hadn't even realized it. So anyway, so just very quickly to wrap up a little bit more about Breakthrough. I'll give you the brief introduction, a little bit more about specifically what we're working on. We work on the ground in the US and in India, and then we work at regional and global levels both out of those 2 countries, whether it's through on-the-ground partnerships or the magic of the internet or anything in between. And we do agenda setting in global spaces as well. So in the US, just to make it more concrete for you, we've just launched actually not just, but one of the areas that we're working on is campus sexual assault. And what we're saying is how can we leverage the power of students, including fraternities and sororities, to drive culture change on campus, to make sexual violence on campus, which is something you guys can tell me more about than I can tell you, but how can we leverage the power of the students who are already there to take action and not just focus on individual acts or perpetrators or survivors, but make it acceptable across campus. How can we leverage the power of students who may or may not be touched by the issue, may or may not be directly involved? What can we do to drive culture change? And especially so that these students, when they graduate, will continue to drive culture change. So we're doing on-campus workshops with fraternity members. We're doing forums where we bring people who work on sexual violence together with people who are part of the Greek system. We're developing some national campaigning. We are developing a multimedia toolkit. We're doing all sorts of things to make that very concrete, starting on individual campuses and then moving beyond. We just launched our first workshops at the University of Indiana. And we're also, we have several animations that have shown at NASCAR races, Indy 500, Green Bay Packers home games at the area where fans tailgate, challenging sports fans to interrupt sexual harassment, just kind of the micro-violence that happens at parties, and we have a whole Be That Guy hashtag, which encourages, and anyone can be that guy, you don't have to be a guy, but be the guy who says, just, dude, no. And when you do that, you find out that actually 8 out of 10 people around you agree with you. You're just the one who was courageous enough to speak up. Most people think that they're the only one who thinks that's not okay, but when they speak up, they find out everyone else agrees, and they're glad someone else said something. So we've had those on jumbotrons all over the place. They've been doing great, and we're also the last thing I'll mention is that we are planning right now our 2nd annual comedy show in New York City called Dudes Against Violence Against Women, because duh. And we had a really great lineup. We sold out the worst week in August last year. The worst week is the week before, the last week of August before Labor Day. people turning people away, and like everybody was in Manhattan that week was at Gotham Comedy Club. Had major shows with great comedians, and we created all sorts of memes and graphics that were spread beyond the show to just send the message: the dudes are against violence against women. And it's a mainstream thing. It's easy to talk about. It's just, let's just put it out there and talk about it and make it not this private issue that is talked about only if you have a personal story to tell, but it's an issue that's on everyone's agenda, and let's just stand up, challenge it, and take action all together, no matter where we are and who we are. And that's, just to wrap up, that's the message of Breakthrough. The idea that our tagline is human rights start with you. So once again, whatever action you can take in your world, you don't have to be actually a professional activist or a student of activism. You don't have to, it's great if you do, but you don't have to know every article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You just need to know that all of these issues affect all of us. And how can you, in your life, think, am I, in my life, I'm like, am I giving my kids different chores because one's a dude and one's a girl? Did I just tell my son not to wear the sparkly thing? How am I in my own life imparting or supporting these gender norms that really hold everyone back, and how can I stop? How can I treat everyone around me in that same way? How can I encourage others to do the same? And that's the way we build a culture where discrimination and violence are unacceptable, and where the values of human rights carry the day. So that's me. So I'm hoping that you'll join us on all the digital stuff, and but first that you'll pay attention to my colleagues up here. So thank you.
Next.
Yep.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Shalmali, which is a long name. Shalmali Guttal. I'm from India, but I live in Thailand. I work for an organization called Focus on the Global South, which is a big name, but it's not such a big organization. But the name is actually smaller, bigger than what we were able to do. So we call ourselves Focus for short. And she just helped me find our Twitter name, which is @FocusSouth, apparently. I don't have my own Twitter name, which is Common Molly, but I'm pretty bad. I just tweet when I see something outrageous. I take a picture and I tweet it. And I picked Common Molly because I work on the commons, and a common molly is a very common kind of fish, which actually feeds a lot of people. So I thought, okay, that's a good name for me on Twitter. Why not, right? So following up, one thing I'd like to say to all of you that yes, activism can pay. May not make you rich, but it can pay. And you don't necessarily become a bore if you're an activist. I've often been told by people, "Oh, you're vegetarian? You're quite a lot of fun for being a vegetarian." It's like, what? What's wrong with us, And other people tell me, you seem to have quite a lot of fun for being an activist. And I say, well, what does being an activist mean? So people sort of think that people who are activists are just always grim and determined. We would never go shopping. We would never eat good food. We won't eat chocolate. I don't know, whatever. I love earrings. We won't wear makeup. Like, oh, come on. It's not true. Life isn't always easy, but it can be a lot of fun. So let me tell you firstly what Focus does. We're a sort of a collective of very committed activist researchers and activist analysts. We were established in 1995. How many of you have heard of the World Trade Organization? Not bad, but quite a lot of you. Now, the World Trade Organization came into existence in 1995. That was the year Focus was born. And one of our first enemies of the public was the World Trade Organization. And the joke among our supporters is that Focus will close its doors the day they can close the World Trade Organization down. Unfortunately, the World Trade Organization is still going, so we're still going. Because it's not only the World Trade Organization that we have been fighting against, but it's this model of economy and finance, which is encapsulated by neoliberalism, a sort of a very hyper-market capitalism, which is being promoted by the World Trade Organization, but also by all our governments now, by the World Bank, by a number of corporations, all the corporations, and by a number of financial institutions. So we came together to find different ways of achieving social, economic, ecological, and gender justice. And we found that one very important thing that we have to do, if we're really committed to that, is we have to challenge the whole system. Because we can put you can try and fix the wiring. You can say, oh, globalization has its pros and cons, and it'll eventually work for people, etc., etc. Fix the wiring and it'll work. But we found that doesn't happen, because there are very particular types of people who can get ahead with globalization. People who are already from wealthy families or middle-class families or educational opportunities and so on are able to take a lot of advantages of economic globalization. But for people who are in rural areas in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and I think probably here too in the United States, for people in inner cities who live in slums, for people who've been historically marginalized for race, for caste, for whatever culture or religion they don't have those opportunities. So the word of globalization is not necessarily, this word that throws up all these wonderful opportunities. The places where I work, which is India, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, and Thailand, what globalization means is, workers, mostly women, working in garment factories for less than any minimum wage that you could conceive of, working in very insecure conditions, had forced to work by piecework, so they have, in addition to their 10-hour day, they have to take on extra work just to be able to get their basic wage, unable to unionize, unable to bargain. And if they protest, they're shot or they're arrested. And if they're shot or arrested, being women, they're subjected to various other kinds of violence. So that is a face of globalization. That is a face of free trade. That is a face of free investment. Similarly, in the rural areas, we work a lot on people's rights to land, people's rights to food, people's right to water. And what the face of globalization that they see is corporations coming in, setting up these massive plantations or industrial farms, or big real estate, what do you call them? Real estate estates, where they develop luxury housing for retirement communities. So for example, in Cambodia, a lot of land is going for retirees from Korea. So South Koreans are wealthy. Their own system doesn't know how to look after the elders, so they're being moved over to places like Cambodia. So a Korean company gets a massive concession, and we're talking, thousands of acres. We're not talking about something as big as this library, but a huge space. And these become complexes where people are moved, and the whole space becomes like Korea land, which is not like anything against Koreans. It's not Koreans who are bad. They're not evil people, not at all. And in every society, we have people who grow older. A society must look after its older and vulnerable people. The unfortunate thing is that a wealthy society can exploit another society or another place which has fewer resources, right? And where they really need the money. So social welfare for one group comes at horrible price and horrible cost for another. So for us, these inequalities and imbalances are really the part and parcel of what's happening with globalization. And today we're in a new era, well not just now, but since the last 5 or 6 years, and I'm sure in your class you've discussed this, we have a new advanced element of globalization, and which is the power of finance capital. So if you see the way banks are sort of doing their little shenanigans all over the world, they get a slap on their wrist and they keep going. A lot of investors, a lot of companies that invest in land in my country, in Cambodia, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, they're finance corporations. None of them have ever farmed anything in their life. Now, none of them have ever fished anything. But they're taking these very real, what shall I say? I don't want to use the word asset because that makes it sound, very much in the financial market. But they take these very real wealth, not this natural wealth, and then it gets converted to something that's used as collateral, which is traded and so on. But we can come to that later. So what Focus does I'll be quick about this. We basically work with social movements, the public. We work with elected policymakers. We work with students, we work with academics. We try to build multi-actor platforms to challenge the structures and the systems that are exploitative and oppressive. And we have our deep belief is that progressive social change will come, and the best kind of progressive social change comes when society, all its diversity, participates in that. So policy making could not be in the hands of an elite group. You know, because the elite groups, you know, they're wealthy. They don't care what policy, I mean, they want policies to support them, but they don't suffer the consequences. But those who bear the impacts of policies and programs and trends should be at the front line of saying, this is what we need. That's how you build a just society. But very often, people who are at the front lines of facing, you know, the bad and the negative impacts are the people who don't have access to information. They're not the people who will be consulted. More likely, they will be threatened and intimidated and kicked off their land, or, you know, forced to work in very insecure conditions and so on. So we work a lot with farmers' movements, organizations of fisher folk, indigenous peoples. We work with unions. We work a lot with women workers and women human rights defenders. We work a lot in conflict areas where natural resources or, you know, investment projects are protected by the military, because that's a different type of violence, you know, a different type of threat that emerges. And we work with them so that people understand what's happening. Who are they? So a company comes to take the land, we say, okay, who is this company? Why is it here? What allowed it to get here? How did this company just walk into, you know, your communities and take over 5,000 hectares of land? Who are they? What are they going to grow? Where is this going to go? And we do the research with people in that area. We train people how to do their own action research. And they gather the information, they share it, they mobilize communities, and that way they're advocates for themselves. So it's a sort of, we're big believers in knowledge and power, you know, that knowledge is a very important component of building power. Of course, it's not the only component, because once you have knowledge, you also need agency, you need the ability to be able to act, no? So we do, but knowledge is the first step. And we do a lot of leadership training at the grassroots levels, with unions, especially with workers, and I guess we can call them rights defenders, but, you know, I don't know what you call a fisherwoman or a family of fishers who are trying to stop a big trawler pier being built. I guess they're rights defenders, you know, but usually these are smaller local communities. So we do a lot of work with them, training with them, build up such skills and confidence, get them to be able to talk to their policymakers and so on. So you kind of get the idea, right, of what we do. And we also try and bring people together. So from different constituencies, but also different countries. So for example, if we know that there is an American apparel company that's doing really bad things in Cambodia, what we do is we contact the students here, the movement here, and we connect them up with the workers' unions there. They meet, they talk to each other, because then people who are committed to social and economic justice are talking to each other, you know? It's sort of quite similar to what the breakthrough strategy, you know, get people out of the mainstream, get them working together, and they'll do something with it. So we also do a lot of direct action. We march, we protest, we chain ourselves to things, we get arrested, we give testimonies in Parliament, we organize testimonies in Parliament. We do our best not to break the law. But coming from India, I have firm belief in one of the sayings that Gandhi, who you may all have heard of, said. I will just paraphrase it, that he says his point was that when a law is unjust, it is your moral duty to break it. So when we see what we think are unjust laws, we actually organize and work with people on civil disobedience to say this is an unjust law. But of course we have to be very careful, because there are consequences to all these. Now my personal journey, I'll make it very quick and short. One is that I think, well, I started my education in a school of design, believe it or not, in India. I studied environment design. I went to study environment design. And in the year I went to study environment design, in that a year and a half after that, they closed the environment design faculty. And they said, because there were only two of us students there. So then I said, okay, I have to think about what I'm going to do. Am I going to stay in this, or am I going to look for another college? But I really liked what we were being taught. We were being taught conceptual, very important conceptual tools of how to solve problems. So the entire methodology of teaching in that institution was lateral thinking, analysis, connecting the dots, and it was called the problem-solving methodology. And the philosophy was, once you learn how to connect dots, once you learn and you internalize this kind of problem-solving methodology and analysis, you can apply it to different conditions and different courses. So I stayed in the school, and I started working on different projects. And one of my first projects, when I learned how to use a film camera, was I said, okay, I'm going to go out and make a video. What to make a video of? So I took my video camera and I went out. And I came across a bunch of women talking, and it was all very, very heated, and they were doing some street theater and stuff. And I went up to them and found out, what are they doing? This was a self-employed women's association. It's a very big union now. At that time, they were just starting. This was 1982, 81, 82. It's called SEWA. And they were mobilizing and organizing women in the informal sector. These were women migrants from rural areas who'd come to the city to live there, and were supporting their families through informal sector work, which means they weren't allowed to be unionized. They had no job security, they had no wage security, they had no livelihood security, no environmental security. So SEWA was organizing them. So I got talking to the women, the workers, as well as the community organizers. And then they introduced me to their boss. And their boss said, why don't you make a film with us? And I said, sure. What are we going to make a film on? And she said, education. I said, okay, what education? Then they introduced me to Paulo Freire, who in the 80s at least was a very big influence on the lives of many of us. And I read his works on pedagogy of the oppressed and cultural action for freedom, and I thought, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a popular educator, and I'm going to work with people, and so on. And that's how I got involved with the union movement. Then I started working with another union, which was working on occupational health. And I went to make video film there, and I found that here were these workers who were working in factories that produced batteries and electronics. And the places that they lived in and where their children played were horrific. I mean, I come from a middle-class family. I'm not a wealthy person, but I saw where those children were playing and where people were living. I couldn't sleep for days. It was horrific. So then I got involved in occupational safety, and I talked to my college, and I said, okay, I came to study environment design. This is environment design. We have to do something about this environment. You know, we cannot. So more and more people in my college, my friends got involved with me, etc. And then remember, we were all design students. So what came very easily to us was making outreach materials. We could make posters in a couple of hours. I would just phone somebody and say, hey, I need a poster on how to dispose of batteries. I need a poster on why, women can't be walking here alone. And I got it. My friends would, in the design school pitched in. They pasted, they did, whatever. So then we started working on theater. So anyway, that was my college education. Then when I finished that, three friends of mine and four of us set up our own research and design firm, where we did pro bono work for social movements, mobilizing against, corporate practices, bad corporate practices, state authoritarianism. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Narmada Dams movement in India. That was also starting at that time, so we got very involved in that movement. And we continued to do creative work. We were designing educational programs, we were designing brochures, we were designing campaigns, all that. Quite a bit, actually, like what you were doing. So after that, I came to the United States, to Cornell University, to study communication and education and development. And I think things changed quite a bit for me, because then I learned about political economy. I studied, and that's when I met Radhika. And we had a common advisor who really, for me, changed my life by the way she taught me. She gave me tools of how to analyze what was happening in the world of work, And I think for me, learning political economy was very, very important. From that, I moved on to political ecology to try to understand what's happening in the natural resource world, how do we apply these analyses of power there? And then after that, so it's a very funny, odd way. And then from there, I went to work in Laos with my husband. And Laos at that time was just recovering still from the Vietnam War. Although it had been 15 years since the war, but things were still bombed out, it was slowly opening up. We started working in very rural areas. And I started getting really involved in political ecology issues, land rights, water rights, forest rights, and so on. And when Focus was started in 1995 by a Filipino academic and an Indian academic, and they wanted to set up a space in Asia where young Asian activists, analysts could produce analysis about Asia. Because they said, why do we always have to read what is produced by people outside Asia? We're smart, we can do our own analysis. Because Asia is very big. So we started with an office in Thailand, then we opened one in India, which I went to open and work, and then one in the Philippines, and so on. And and here I am, 15 years later, and sitting in front of you. A few things I think that have been very important to me. One is that along the way, I kind of learned that I had to flip the scale. So for me, the political became personal. You know, the injustices meant a lot. It doesn't mean that I'm never going to sleep at night, but I do have a husband who doesn't sleep at night because he worries about climate change, but that's another matter. But no, but I mean, the thing is, for us it became, not just me, but my colleagues and friends, it became really, really important that the way we live is, it's what you were saying, you know, the way we live, what we do, the choices we make, reflect the goals and ideals that we believe in. So that's one thing. Another thing is I'm very fortunate also that I come from a history, my family has a history of some type of activism. Both my parents' side, they were civil rights lawyers, and they were very actively involved against, well, British colonialism was a long time ago, before even I was born, but they were involved in fighting, you know, British colonialism. So I sort of grew up with ideas of social justice, economic justice, political justice, decolonization. All that stuff was talked a lot in my house. So it wasn't unusual for me to, you know, to go in this direction. And the third very important thing for me, I think, a little bit of an epiphany was about 6 years ago. I was sitting in a conference, and I was listening to it, and I thought, oh my God, I just heard this last year. Oh. And then another session, oh God, I just heard this last year too. And then when it was my turn to speak, I found I had nothing new to say. And I realized that as part of being a global activist, I was globally trotting all over the world. And everybody loved me because I was this brown woman with nice ethnic clothes. No, I'm serious, you know, who could stand, I was the speaker of the global South, you know. But I thought to myself, what do I know? I've just been in conferences in the last few years. And so I stopped, and I re-immersed myself. I decided I have to re-educate myself. So I started working more and more locally. And so now, luckily, I know a lot more. Thank God, I re-educated myself. I feel better about the way I live my life. Unfortunately, though, the more local you go, the more difficult the fight gets. Because then, you know, every worker that's beaten up becomes important. Every human rights defender that's jailed becomes important. Every person who is assassinated or disappeared becomes important. But despite all that, I'm not unhappy that I went into the local sphere. And being here at CWGL is really good for me because it gives me a little bit of distance, and I really need this distance, believe me, at this time. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
I feel a little bit like I need to snap out of it because I've been so immersed in listening to the two of you, and now I find that it's my turn. And I'm a little bit sad about that because I feel like I could have continued to listen to your, you know, personal trajectories and your political work and organizing work. Well, hello everyone, first of all. My name is Diana DUarte, and I am the communications director for an organization called Madre. Madre is an international women's human rights organization. We've been around since 1983, so a good long chunk of time. And I see Radhika pulled up her phone, so good reminder if you should be tweeting. Our Twitter handle is @MadreSpeaks. So another point I wanted to make before I jump too much into what I have to say is that I've been really, again, as I was listening to the two of you, appreciating this combination of personal stories with sort of professional work, because I don't know that oftentimes we're encouraged to include the personal and when we're presenting about the work, and that it does have resonance. And just listening to what we've, and I hope that when we get into the Q&A, we can sort of get into that a bit and to see how you all personally are thinking about activism in your life and your trajectory and so on. But to say a little bit about Madre, in the 30+ years that we've been around, we've been working with grassroots women's groups in communities all around the world that are affected by both war and disaster. We started out in Latin America, in Nicaragua first and then expanding. And nowadays we have partnerships in Latin America, the Middle East, and in Africa primarily. And you know, the organization has certainly grown and shifted over the years, but there has been a constant sort of essence to the organization over the years, and that has to do with the value that we place in partnerships. We work with grassroots women's groups in each of the communities that we partner in who have clearly through the years that they've lived and worked in their own communities identified what the issues are. And they have the most core expertise that as an international organization we see our role in really providing them with the resources, potentially training, access to spaces that they need in order to be able to address the threats that they're facing both in the immediate sense and in terms of meeting urgent needs, but also in a more lasting sense in terms of changing policies that are creating the threats that they face, like what you were saying about neoliberalism, or even addressing issues about the culture that people are sort of immersed in. How can we change the culture of, that affects us all? So we have two primary sort of modes of work. We do the partnerships with our grassroots partners, and that has to do, and it really changes depending on which context you're talking about. In some places we're running women's shelters with our partners, in other places we're doing community radio programs, in other places we're doing farming initiatives or attempts to address climate change. And all of that combines with with a human rights advocacy strategy that can take place in multiple levels, including the international level. I understood from Elmira that some of you were participating in the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, all of you. So maybe in the Q&A we might have a chance to sort of talk about that as a space for activism, for women's activism, and any impressions that you had of being part of that. That is a place that Madre has been active in over the years, and that we see one of our roles is in being able to facilitate our partners, our grassroots partners, being able to participate in those spaces. And so we see it as an opportunity, clearly, for those meetings and convenings and strategizing conversations, but we also very clearly recognize what the challenges are associated with international elite policy-making spaces where oftentimes women in civil society are shut out, are not really given the space to, and will have to fight for the space to be able to be heard and to influence global policy, influence what's happening inside the UN. So maybe in the Q&A we might talk about that a bit more. Personal story of activism. Again, I've been asked to share that often, so I had to think on it a little bit. A few things came to mind, and I don't know that they'll be entirely coherent, but maybe you all can help me pull them into a narrative. My parents are immigrants from the Cape Verde Islands, and so, and then also my father was a diplomat for the U.S. And working with USAID, so we ended up traveling all over the world. The USAID is the Agency for International Development. And so there was always this sense that we were far away from the people who mattered to us, that either we were far away from my grandparents and the people my parents had grown up with, and then of course when we would be traveling around the world, even our relatives in the US were far away. So storytelling was huge in my family, where we would constantly be telling and retelling stories about where we came from and where we had been and who was important and what was important to us. I was telling Lynn on the train that if you were a good storyteller, that was a big leg up in the family. It was important that you could be able to hold forth and captivate an audience, and we would compete with each other, and you would interrupt each other's stories, or be like, oh, actually, I can tell that story much better. You stop, I'll take over, that kind of thing. So also, even to the point where when friends and colleagues and whatever would come over, it's intimidating to be in my household when the 6 of us are together and we're all holding forth and there's no breath in between. If you have something to say, you really have to jump in, be super aggressive. I've learned to pull back a little bit, let's say that much, from having to interact with the wider world. But I did understand very early on in my life how important storytelling is and how it can connect you with people who may actually be or just seem far away from you, whether in distance or just in lived experience. If you can tell a story that reaches out or connects to people on a very values-based or personal level, it can do a whole lot. It can do so much. And so that was a core value from the beginning. I had decided in middle school I would be a novelist. For 3 years I wrote a novel. It was many hundreds of pages long, an epic even. I lost it. We moved and then it got lost. It was a terrible, terrible loss. And then in high school, I had decided I was going to be a journalist, actually, and I was going to expose all the injustices of the world, primarily starting with my high school sports program, which I thought was overfunded. And so that was my bone to pick with the world for a while. And I had in my head also, that was around the time that I started to think about being a woman in the world and what that meant and what opportunities there were and what also threats and challenges were associated with it. But it wasn't, as you were saying before, Lynn, it wasn't that I had like an aha moment where all of a sudden I decided this is my moment of political awakening. It was sort of just the slow accumulation over time of the expectations that people had placed on you, or the lack of expectations if they assumed you couldn't do that kind of thing. And then also, you know, being in an environment in my home where we were talking about issues out in the world and trying to connect the personal and the political and so on. But I will say that for a long time, feminism to me felt like something I was just personally, like it wasn't something that I was going to do out in the world. It was just like, you know, how I saw myself and how I interacted with the world. So when I started thinking about like what I would do for a job, being a feminist activist didn't seem like an option to me, and clearly, you know, spoiler alert, I did become one and get paid to do it. But just to let you know that I had this idea of who I was, but it didn't seem like that was going to be a career. I had to find something else. So I thought I was going to be a journalist. And then I went to college. A week after I started in college was 9/11, and it felt like my whole world changed very dramatically in that moment. And also, I will also say that that year was also Bush's first year of presidency. And so when my 4 years of college were essentially the first 4 years of his presidency. And I felt like that really shaped how I saw the role of the US in the world. And just feeling like as a young person, as an activist, that there was a sense of urgency that you had to be countering the harmful policies that were being put out in our name. And so I decided that maybe journalism wasn't for me, that I was going to move to DC and I was going to change all the policies somehow. And I ended up working at an organization that did work on US-Africa advocacy. And at that moment, I had this sense of if I just did the right research and I put it all in a good package and I put it in front of somebody who was a decision maker, they would see how right I was and they would change their minds. And it was very naive. But the organization that I was at had a very strong focus on communications. That's another thing that I was noticing as we were sort of going down the line, this role of being able of using communications as a mode of activism and mobilizing and organizing. So I really came to deeply appreciate that with the help of a woman who was my mentor at the time, and decided that that was what I wanted to be doing. And that also I saw that there were opportunities at organizations like the one I've worked at now for the past close to 8 years to really put my deeply held personal principles into action. And so being a communications person and working at Madre has really allowed me to combine all of that into one package. You'll remember a moment ago I said the whole thing about stories, how I love to tell stories. So I did come prepared with like a few examples of Madre's work through the lens of stories about individual people that we've worked with, our partners. And I'll kind of jump around just to give you a few examples from different places in the world, and then I'll try to wrap it up quickly so we can move to the Q&A, but I'm sure a lot of you have been following in the news the situation with ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and the incredible violations and brutality that they've been meting out to communities at large, but particularly sexual violence and rape that they've been attacking women with. And we, for many years as Madre, have been working in partnership with an Iraqi women's organization called the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq. We started working with them after the US invasion and during the occupation, when we saw this incredible surge in levels of violence against women and girls there, who, at the hands of militias and sort of fundamentalist forces that were empowered by the US occupation. So that's the origins of our relationship with OFI, the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq. And OFI is led by an incredible activist named Yanar Mohammed. I think you've met many times. And in the past year, since ISIS has really just surged into the northern part of Iraq, Yanar and her other colleagues at OFI have been able to mobilize their existing network of activists and their resources that they've had from being in a leading organization in that area for years to be able to put in place very concrete protections for women who are at risk. So they've had a network of women's shelters in different cities across Iraq for some time. When this particular crisis came up, they were able to really mobilize around that and activate that network of shelters to say and put out the word for women in the northern part of Iraq who were at risk and needed to flee, that they would have this place that they could run to, that they could come to the shelters that OFI had been running for some time. And Yanar is originally from that part of Iraq. She has family in the north of Iraq, so she knew. When I saw her a few weeks ago, she was telling us about how the fact that she could speak about those places, what was home for those people, and she could speak in their language and just be very present with them and understand what was the context they were coming from, meant so much. It meant that people felt comfortable with her. It meant that she could sort of learn who they were and what their needs were and what they wanted to see, what kind of service they needed from OFI or not. And so one of the things that OFI, under Yanar's leadership and others of her colleagues were able to do was to create what they call a women's peace farm. And that's just outside of the city of Karbala in southern Iraq, where they've been able to create what it sounds like. It's a farm. And the women who are displaced from the north, in many places where farming is a way of life, have been able to come and sort of rebuild their life in the relative safety of southern Iraq outside of Karbala. Just a little side story because I love this story. When I was speaking to Jannat, who's one of the women who works with OFI, she told me about that there's a 9-year-old girl who lives at the peace farm with her family, her mother and her family, who was displaced from the north, and her name is Diana. She has turned herself into sort of like the organizer of the children of the peace farm. So she goes around interviewing each of her sort of like young colleagues and asks them, what do you need? Do you need more books, or do you need socks, or do you need a coat, or do you need whatever it is in your life that you need? And she makes a list, and she goes to one of the women at OFI who helps coordinate the farm, and she presents, like, these are the demands of the children, please. And so those kinds of stories are when you think about like where activism comes from, it comes from everywhere. It comes from a 9-year-old who's been displaced and now has looked up to the women of OFI and other women around her and seen what they do when they're able to organize. And so she decided, I'm going to organize the children. And then one other quick story. One of the roles that Madre plays is in putting our partners in touch with each other so that they can share expertise across contexts in ways that might not otherwise be possible. We work a lot with indigenous women's organizations in places that are very far afield from each other, for example, Nicaragua and also Kenya. And a few years ago, we facilitated one of our partners from Nicaragua, a woman named Rose Cunningham, who leads an indigenous women's group on the North Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, to travel with us to Kenya, to a rural area in Kenya where we work with another indigenous women's group called the Indigenous Information Network, to exchange experiences and to talk about how climate change was affecting them both in rural Kenya and on the North Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, and to exchange very concrete tactics. So, you know, drought has been an incredible threat against many communities in rural Kenya for many years now. And so Rose was able to share some rain harvesting techniques that she had sort of spearheaded and created in her own community in ways that would be, you know, transferable, useful in the communities that Lucy Mulenke, who leads IAN, the Indigenous Information Network, was, you know, she was able to then take that information from Rose for application in her own community. And then, of course, they talked about the international human rights system and what are the opportunities for Indigenous women to organize and to have their voices be heard at the international level. What are the commonalities, what are the common demands that they might want to come together around in order to advocate at the international level. During one of these human rights workshops, there was a woman there who was very pregnant, and while they were having these conversations that Madre helped to facilitate, and she did go into labor during the workshop. She was able to stay through the end of the workshop, and because it's a real testament to how much she wanted to be there, to be having this conversation about human rights, about women's organizing. And found out later that the next day when her daughter was born, she named her Rose Mulenke. So she combined the names of the two women from Nicaragua and from Kenya into the name of her daughter. So there was a lasting impact of that workshop. And I've also, you know, that's just one sort of, I like that story because it's cute and it's a reflection of what it means to people when they're able to come together across seeming difference. But I think that it's also, there's other impacts beyond that. You know, Rose and Lucy, besides having this little girl who shares both of their names, are partners in the work. And they have an ongoing conversation that exists both at the local level and at the international level. So that's one of the things, I mean, all of these stories, and there's many more I could tell, animate our work, and they sort of give us I mean, certainly as one of the communications people at Madre, it's very useful to be able to have these inspiring stories to show people what the actual impact of this work is in our partners' lives and in many other people's lives. But I think it's just inspiration for each of us who works in any capacity at Madre or at any organization like Madre to know what kind of impact you're able to have doing this kind of work. And a short PS, we do hire interns. So if anybody is interested, you know, communications is the role that I play, but we offer internships sort of like across the gamut of the different functions of the organization, program, advocacy, development. So if you're interested, please do talk to me about it. Thank you.
Can I just ask someone a big favor? Would anyone be willing to run get me a little bit more water? Or I can go do it, but then I'll miss something interesting. Okay, thank you, thank you. Anyone else? Do you guys need?
I still have
So now it's the time for everybody to get a chance to ask questions and to exchange comments and thoughts with everyone. I forgot to say at the beginning, so I'm going to say it now. We're taping this whole program, and so if when you ask a question or if you don't want to be seen, you need to let us know, but otherwise you will be recorded for posterity and be able to see yourself very soon on the Center for Women's Global Leadership website, so which will give us an opportunity for more people to hear about this fabulous panel we just heard from and to hear your conversation as well. So now is the time to join in the conversation, and if we need to, we have a couple of microphones here that we can pass around. So we're just going to let that happen. I'm not going to be the referee for it. You just need to stand up and start talking. Go ahead.
I'm interested in kind of the fact like recent economic policies of TPP as
Can you just a second? Can people in the back hear her all right? Or do we need to have her have the mic? Or let's do it. So, yeah, we can pass it around so we're sure.
So what I'm interested in is how recent and very concerned.
Did he turn it on over there, Kyle?
Oh, yeah. Alright, I'll try to speak louder for everyone. So I'm interested in how recent economic policies like TPP, NAFTA, things like that, has had an effect on your own personal work. Has it been harder for capacity building? Has it been harder for like the politicians or governments to kind of accept the work you're doing, and how receptive they have been in like the wake of these type of policies?
Should we take a few questions together and then
I'll forget.
you need to respond right away? Okay. Good. Very good question. And yes, it has made a big difference to us. One of the things that's happening is that if you look at, for example, what's being discussed in the UN now for this post-2015, and if you look at the kinds of development models that are being promoted by all the governments, especially on what they call the emerging economies or the developing world, the development model is really more or less a free trade and investment model. So what's happened is, I don't know how many of you know structural adjustment, or have you have heard of it? Okay. So what happened with structural adjustment is that majority of the countries of Asia, Latin America, Africa, the governments had to stop putting money into the public services and all, So it was privatization, it was liberalization of the economy, and so on, right? So what's happening is that governments see investment, corporate investment, unregulated investment as a way of bringing capital into the country. And companies don't come unless they get a contract from the government, which basically keeps them above the law. So regulations are being rewritten in our countries to allow corporations to do whatever they want to do. And they're not, and so, and they're literally, they're getting to be so powerful that they can be above the law. And if the governments try to change the contract to regulate the corporation in case the prices are going too high for water, whatever, companies can sue our governments. So what's happening, and in the meantime, there is no other capital. There's no other investment capital coming in. And another thing that's happening, for example, in the region where I'm working most intensively now, is that a lot of rich countries provide what is called development aid, but development aid is tied with investment. So the United States, for example, does not provide aid to any of the countries in that region without linking it either to a military agreement or to their private companies. If you look at Japanese aid, I've done analyses of Japanese aid, very often the check, just to be blunt, to make it a bit simplistic, but the money goes from the Ministry of Finance in Japan to a Japanese corporation. It doesn't even reach the country. So aid, this kind of development aid, is tied to goods and services, which are provided then by a company from that country. So TPP, for example, has been, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is very, very scary partnership. There is an entire chapter in there on investor-state dispute resolution. If you Google it, WikiLeaks leaked it, the goddess has smiled on us because it's out now. Everybody can see it. Where basically United States, Canada, Australia, a bunch of countries, Japan, have got their lawyers to draft this chapter where governments are giving up any sovereign right to take a corporation to court. So it has made things very, very difficult for us because when we fight with the governments and argue with the governments and say, well, this is wrong, we say, well, okay, but where's the capital coming from? If this company doesn't bring in the capital, or if this company doesn't come and invest in infrastructure, we don't have the money for that. So that is definitely, I'm sorry, it's a long answer.
It's scary too.
And if you'd like to come and intern with us on this issue, please do. We need more people working on this trade and investment. Sorry.
I'm going to read it really. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So hi, I'm Shana Shahid. So I have two questions. So why hasn't your organization reached out to Bangladesh? Why hasn't your organization reached out to Bangladesh? Because a lot of the export labor and for fabric companies and things like that. Also, if So when we think of like the model of progress, we always measure it to like the U.S. or whatever the West. So for those countries in the global south, what is going to be the standard of progress? What are you guys measuring to? That's it.
Another two very good questions. Regarding Bangladesh, we don't have an office in Bangladesh, but we do work with unions in Bangladesh. So we work with, and especially in the manufacturing sector. So the three constituencies we work with very closely in Bangladesh are the farmers, fisherfolk, and the garment workers, particularly. So, for example, you must have read, all of you must know about the factory burns, etc. So my organization was one of a bunch of coalitions of organizations working. The thing is, we don't have money to have offices everywhere. So our office for South Asia is in India, because it was the easiest place for us to get a permit, and some of us are Indians. We're not able to have an office in every country that where we work with people. So that's what. So we do work with them. Now, in terms of progress, that's really a big challenge, and this is why our new program, not new, but our highlight of this of the current work program, we develop our strategies in 3 to 5 year cycles, is called People's Alternatives in Asia. So what is the development model that actually best responds to the rights of people, responds to inequality, systemic and entrenched inequality and inequity? What is it that is within the planet's carrying capacity? Because we also have a catastrophic climate change happening. And so what we're hearing from unions, social movements, and other groups is that we cannot follow this economic growth-driven model. It's just not possible. And it's not only that the developing countries, or Asia, Africa, Latin America must change, but Europe and North America must change. This level of consumption, where some people can have so much, while others have nothing, it's just not acceptable, and nobody can keep consuming to that level. And I'm sure, Madhuri, you work with disasters, places affected by disasters. So many of those disasters are climate change related, And what we see in the wake of those is an immediately the model for reconstructing those places is a private sector driven model. Companies get contracted to develop new resorts, etc. So what we're working with social movements and a lot of legislators and academics in the South, global South, but also in the North, so for example with CWGL, is that what is a different model of development? What is progress? No? So it's a work in progress, and we need many more young minds to get involved and say, okay, what they think progress should be. You want to speak to this?
Yeah, just one point about coming up with new models of development, and I think there's an idea, it's almost a facile idea, that in order to do development writ large, you need to have one huge strategy, right? And I think that our experience at Madre, and I think a lot of different organizations have, and social movements have come to the conclusion that the solutions are actually to be found at a very local and grassroots level. Like when we talk about sustainable development, we are talking about very community-based solutions. Especially when we're talking about climate change, and how people are building communities that are more resilient to climate change. So when the hurricane does come, the hurricanes that are more frequent and more powerful, that people are able to withstand them and to survive them. But to understand that the model of consumption, as you were saying, that we've been engaging with for far too long now, that has created the crisis that we're in, needs to be scaled back dramatically. And so who is modeling that? And almost exclusively it's small groups, it's small scale answers, and in a lot of cases being led by women, by grassroots women. So I just wanted to say that as an addition.
Hi, sorry. My name is Francine. I'm not in the class, but it sounds like a great class and program. I'm a senior here, and I'm interested in politics, and so the way I see this is that a lot of change can happen by putting women who support your missions into office and having them work on policies and get policies passed or other policies amended. So are you doing any work around the world to get women into office?
that's an area where we need some culture change for one thing. We don't work on that issue specifically, but one thing I know is that, and you must know this yourself, since this is where you're thinking, is that there's, you know, for people who, well, let's put it this way. So women are not even running for office because they're saying they don't want to because they're going to be harassed and intimidated and exposed to a level of hateful, misogynist, stalking, everything from, you know, hate tweets to personal stalking and everything in between. And it's not a matter of women, you know, not being able to put up with the mudslinging, because there's been mudslinging in politics for years. Everyone knows that. Everyone can handle at least a minimum of the normal stuff, right? But the level it's gotten to is really being framed these days, the level of online harassment, all the stuff that you guys have heard about, is actually being framed as a civil and human rights issue. Because women are leaving spaces that they're entitled to be in. Whether it's being public spaces, it's public spaces. Whether it's leaving, you know, being a professional or public feminist on Twitter, whether it's, and as an aside, it's not the same thing, but women are leaving tech, women are leaving Wall Street because the level of subtle daily sexism, like girls push-ups type stuff, which every day is a big thing, to much more significant, everything ranging from, you know, subtle discrimination, subtly not being invited to the golf party kind of stuff, all the way to outright misogyny and harassment and stalking, is keeping women and either driving women out or keeping them out. And so while we don't work, speaking just for Breakthrough, while we don't work specifically on electoral politics in that way and training women and that direct stuff that other organizations do very well, we try to focus on how can we make these spaces accessible to everybody? How can we enable everybody to realize their full potential? And whether it's whether it's women or people who are marginalized in any way, if they don't have full access to all of these spaces, business, politics, tech, anything, then that is a human rights problem in the United States. And that is the way we frame it, and that is the way we address it. And that's why what we would do in that area is call on not just, you know, I was kind of, not corny, but kind of very personal when I was talking about the kinds of moments that are opportunities for us to bring human rights into our lives. But we also call on, it's not just, you know, calling on me to make sure I have chore equality with my daughter and my son, right? Which is important, and actually it's important for a million reasons, and that's why I keep coming back to that one. There are studies about how important that is, but we're also calling on the heads of institutions, the heads of companies, the heads of corporations, people in those corporations, people with the power to change the way, to change the pathways that people have to politics or what have you, to change the climates in their companies. We had specifically one example. We inspired the head of Rajanananda, one of the heads of Google in India, to say that for at least for 1 year, he sort of set up a specific benchmark for himself. He's also an angel investor, and he said, "I am not going to." We were asking people to make we're asking people, what concrete action will you take to challenge violence and discrimination? And he said, "I will not fund any startup that does not have women on its startup team." So that is concrete. That's that kind of thing. If we got everybody to sort of think like, okay, what can I do in my world? What can I do? I work at Twitter. What can I do? Not me, but no, I work at Twitter. What can I do? Twitter just did amend some of its policies. What can I do to clear the pathways so that women and everybody who's marginalized can occupy these spaces that they have the right to occupy? And that's, so that's my long sort of inspirational speech answer. But so the answer is no, but This is where we can all actually contribute to that kind of change, whether we want to run for office ourselves or not.
Well, from our side, we also don't have a special program for people running for office, but one of the things we do a lot is work with women in different social movements and unions so that they can assume leadership positions there, and that gives them a leg up to move into public life. So for example, a lot of farmers' movements, they have special women's caucuses. But what we're working with them on is that these women's caucuses then become part of the overall leadership. So for example, La Via Campesina, which is an international movement of peasant farmers, they actually have in their what do you call it, articles of organization, 50% men, 50% women. And in every region, in the coordinating committee, there will always be one man, one woman. And I think they're the only farmers organization that have taken on patriarchy within the movement. And in South Asia, it's really challenging, but they keep at it, you know. So that's another thing. And for me, it's been very gratifying. For example, last year at the Committee for World Food Security, which in Food and Agriculture Organization, to see the head of the FAO sitting around the table with the USAID, a whole bunch of other governments, DFID, etc., and the farmers' movement. The farmers' movement who were there, they were all women. The leaders were all women. And the discussion was, how do you switch from industrial agriculture to agroecology? USAID, Food and Agriculture Organization, Monsanto, FAO, they were all saying, well, the costs are blah, blah, blah. And these women said, no, this is how you do it. You know, they had it. They said, we've done it. We've turned our farms around. One of them was a Canadian farmer, so she could talk about temperate region farming. Another was an African farmer from North Africa, and another one was an Indian farmer, you know, who's been doing, they've been running agroecological farms for God knows how long in southern India. So that was a real gratifying moment because you had all these, no offense intended, white men with beards who were ready to talk down to these women. And these women were like, no, you know, this is how you do it. And they demanded like a commitment. And the director of the Committee for World Food Security had to give a commitment on paper. This is what we're going to do. So it wasn't a commitment on gender equality, but it was women kicking ass. At that level, I was so happy.
Read that.
You know? No, seriously. The first time when Seva started a bank, oh my goodness, to go into this bank where you saw rural women who had been kicked and thrown around everywhere, running a bank. It was something, you know. And they were running a bank for informal sector workers, you know. So
it should be a reality show. Seriously, like a really good one. It would be great.
And the bank still exists, the Seva Bank. It's one of the best banks. Whatever else may have happened to Seva, their bank is really good. Sorry, Joan.
Well, just to add a little bit, I feel like in essence your question is about women's voices at the table and what is the impact of having women's voices at the table. And I think there's a lot of tables where women's voices should be.
Yeah.
And I think that you guys have given some examples of spaces like that. And I mean, just to give an area that Madre has been working on a lot lately is around trying to restart, re-energize, and have women's voices be central in the Syrian peace process, which has completely collapsed. And meanwhile, the war continues, the human rights crisis, the humanitarian crisis also continues. And the efforts so far to have women at the table, women's organizations, advocates at the table have been met with very fierce resistance because it's just not seen as a priority among a lot of the men with guns.
Yeah.
And so that's another example that comes to mind of where there is such a hurdle to overcome when it seems so clear that the benefits of having women's voices at the table would be immense. There's evidence to show that peace agreements tend to last longer and be more sustainable when women have been included in the process of creating that peace. Northern Ireland is one example. Because women, especially when they're organized, are able to represent many different voices in the community and bring that to the discussion of a peace negotiation. And there was one other point, which was this. to the point of having women be involved as elected leaders, I think that is important. I would widen it to talk about political participation writ large, just participating in the process, whether it is being seeking election. And maybe this is a note of caution or of warning to say that not all women are good leaders.
Yeah.
I mean, just to say that when we try to seek to have women be in the space at the table, what we're saying is that we want that benefit of the gender perspective at the table, and we can all name women leaders who have not been who have not played that role. So just talk about like women's participation writ large, I think is important. Political participation.
So I have two questions. Thank you very much. First, my name is Olivia. My first question would be for Lynn Harris. You told us about the importance of challenging cultural norms and that so as to make violence against women, gender-based violence or discrimination unacceptable. But how do you do when women sometimes are not always aware of all the forms of discrimination which are against them, of the violence, because sometimes, because of this so mainstream culture, they assume that rape is okay, or that it's was in the gray area, or things like that. And my second question is for Shalmali Guttal. I was very moved by the fact that it's not enough to do small steps and to do small actions, but you have to challenge the whole system and destroy the World Trade Organization. But my question is, how could you bring such a huge change? Because as you said, like all corporations, governments are supporting it. So how do you imagine we could completely reshape the system?
Good questions. Okay. So I'll answer your question a little bit from a strategy perspective as opposed to sort of a philosophy perspective. And just to boil it down, it's the idea of how do we change these norms when not only are they so entrenched, but when a lot of people buy into them and frankly get a lot out of them, including women, right? And I think that from a strategy perspective, you can do this because if your organization's approach is to build constituency, in other words, to get people, to sort of whip people up into a critical mass who are going to be the ones who are saying, that ain't right, and let's make a change, and let's build a different world, let's build a different set of norms. The people that you're talking to first are people who pretty much agree with you. Or they may not already be seasoned activists or advocates, but they're pretty much somewhere near the same page, or they're primed to be somewhere near the same page. So that our job is not, we don't wake up every day and say, how do we change everyone's mind? We don't do that. That's not necessarily a recommended strategy. What we wake up every day and say is, how can we pull these people together who are sitting out there somewhere saying, that ain't right, or I relate to this story you're telling in some way, but I don't have the tools for action, or I'm not quite sure what to do about it, or I can't put into a sentence yet, but yes, I feel you. Those are the people that you want to bring into your huddle. Because if those are the folks who can create a critical mass, either the people that already agree with you, but haven't taken action, or the people who could very well agree with you but haven't taken action. And actually I should amend what I said. It's not about agree with you, because constituency building is about being relevant to people, right? So if you find the people that you are relevant to already, or very close to being relevant to, give them the tools to take action, and that's your critical mass. And it sort of doesn't matter if the whole world's not going to agree with you. But if you can flip it so that the default setting of the culture, doesn't mean 100%, but the default setting of the culture is the values that you have and upholds, you're doing pretty good. So for example, with marriage equality, we're not done, but we're kind of done, right? We're not done. It is marriage equality. there is not officially across the board marriage equality in the United States, right? Culturally speaking, I mean, how old am I? I'm 46 years old. When 20 years ago, this was unthinkable. What is happening now with marriage equality was not even a thing at all. It was basically, the main issue around about being gay was, will I get killed if I come out? I mean, it was more like that, not quite that bad, but depending on who, depending on who you are and where you live. The idea that it is almost a culturally done deal that marriage equality is desirable, and the idea that there's such backlash. Yes, there are still these guys like the governor of Alabama, of Indiana, and Arkansas who are putting forth these laws. But look, there was swift and merciless reaction to say, what the, what? No, we're not going to go to your state. What? And so, you see what I'm saying? So it's not, we don't need to change the minds of all of the people who support those terrible laws. We need to make it so that there's a swift and merciless reaction when they happen, right? So the same thing. You got to start with the people who are pretty close to your side, and that's how you can make these sea changes.
Again, yes. You all ask very challenging questions, which is good because it gets my brain moving. I think if we just take the World Trade Organization as an example, no? Because we work on other targets as well. But one way, one way to I don't like use the violent word, but one way to kill it is to make it useless, to make it a big, expensive white elephant. And so what we do when we work on these larger targets with different social movements and unions, and many legislatures, many government people work with us, because there are many government officials in Asia and Africa and Latin America who don't agree with what the World Trade Organization is doing. You know, it's a global agreement, it's a global institution, but they too want to stop what's happening in it, no? So what we do is we work together to say, okay, what are the actions that we can do to throw what we call a spanner in the works in British English, what monkey wrench.
Throw a wrench into it, yeah.
You know, you throw a wrench in the works so that the gear stops functioning and the machinery breaks down. And the World Trade Organization has been that way now for the last 5 years, 6 years, because they have not been able to reach an agreement. And the reason, what's been the sticking point? Agriculture. Farmers' movements, fisher folk around the world have mobilized and said no. And in the United States, the National Family Farm Coalition, through their elected representatives, had the US Department of Agriculture hold hearings of the role of corporations in international trade and what is the United States supporting, you know? So, I mean, even here it's happening. So basically, farmers' organizations have gotten together and basically, you know, marched on the streets, stopped producing food, taken onions and tomatoes and dumped them at the, you know, at Parliament's doors and said, no, this doesn't work. And in the World Trade Organization, if one government gets up and walks out, that's the end. The deal collapses. And we have been successful. Meaning it's a collective we, you know, no one organization can do it. Similarly, the unions have come up together on industrial policy, and they said the World Trade Organization is pushing deindustrialization in Asia, Africa, Latin America. If we have deindustrialization, where will our workers go? And they've been mobilizing. And workers means votes. Farmers are votes. So elected lawmakers, the governments, if they want to stay in business, they need the votes. So we usually, you know, people come together and do these types of strategies. So, I mean, I know it sounds really difficult that you have this massive edifice and we can't bring it down. But I think these everyday actions make a huge difference. You know, everyday actions make a lot of difference. And that's all we can do, no? We can do everyday actions. We can't take on the whole thing just by itself. But sometimes, you know, in India we have this saying, a little ant inside the trunk of an elephant can cause a lot of pain. It can, and that's what we want to be, these little ants, you know, that, although I love elephants. I like ants too. But you know what I mean.
Well, one thing that comes to mind, just, there's a way that when we think about how change happens, when lasting positive social change happens, it can feel very sudden. Like I think the marriage equality example is one where it feels like almost overnight there's dramatic political and social changes happening. And so it becomes hard to see what were all of the decades potentially of little actions that led to that, because there's this big moment of like a Supreme Court decision or some big thing moving that feels like that. Like, how did that happen? Well, was there one thing that led to that? Somebody, I think it was an article I was reading, I wish I could remember the citation, but there was this metaphor about like pillars that hold up oppressive systems, and how, you know, maybe one pillar is the media and another pillar is who knows what, and then, you know, there's all the small actions that people are taking are chipping away at those pillars. So when one falls, maybe the whole system doesn't fall down at once. Maybe over here people are working in religious spaces and you're chipping away. Then when enough of the pillars fall, the whole thing can crumble, and it feels very sudden. And I think it affects how we analyze the way change happens. So when people start to get frustrated or a sense of maybe feeling a little bit demobilized because it's hard to see what change is possible, I find it helpful to remember those past examples of when sudden positive social change happened. That it wasn't just because one person took one action, it was because a generations potentially of people took countless small actions. I'll try to find the citation and share it.
On the other hand, these things have been happening so fast. I mean, it's because of these everyday actions, but I did get sidetracked, but in my own response, but marriage equality and, you know, seatbelts and smoking are things that have seen massive change in my lifetime. When I was a kid, we wore seatbelts you wore seatbelts if you sat like in an actual seat, but we all bounced around the way back, which, you know, and like even our super safety conscious parents were like, you know, have fun, kids, you know, and we didn't wear bike helmets. People smoked everywhere, and that's 30 years ago. That is not a long time, and a lot of little things came together to make those changes. But think about I'm not talking about a legal perspective, just a cultural thing. Like when I first moved to New York in my 20s, it was just normal that when you came home from a night out, you had to wash your clothes because they stank of smoke. Because you could smoke in any bar. Like, and your clothes smelled like smoke for a week, or you had to do your laundry all the time. And so just that, like that it's normal in New York now to not smoke in bars or restaurants or wherever, and it's normal to see like clusters of people outside buildings. You know, no value judgments. I'm just saying that happened so fast, and it is a night and day change. So that also gives me hope, you know, that this stuff feels so ponderous now and so tough and so intractable in many ways, but those things are also supported by, there's also big business interests in what I'm talking about also. So the fact that those things can change, people with those giant pillars in place, is pretty amazing and should give all of us a pretty good feeling.
One other thing to say as well is that I think sometimes people have a concern that we're not being coordinated enough, that we have to pull it all together in order to have this big impact. But in the examples around smoking or marriage equality or places where we've seen big changes in recent years, it wasn't necessarily always the case that everyone had like a conference call every night. It's like, okay, well, you're taking on the media, I'm dealing with the schools.
I totally did that.
You know, there could be change that we're working in. People could be working in concert without even knowing that they're working in concert, which is another point that I find just sort of like boosting when you feel like, oh, am I in this alone? Are we in this alone? It's like, no, there could be people who are working in ways that are advancing all of our aims that we aren't even aware of or are not even within our field of vision.
I'm wondering if we are sort of to the place where what we should do now is to, one, say thank you to these wonderful women who've been helping us to learn. And maybe now we can have some more informal time, so anyone who feels like they have a question that they want to come up and ask one of the other people, or to share that, well, we can finish up by moving from the formal places to the informal places for more private, semi-private, and wonderful conversations together. But again, it has been a wonderful afternoon, I think, and we're grateful for the library for giving us this wonderful space to be in, and to all the people who are supporting this little project of ours, and to the three of you especially for all that you've given us and the rich understandings that we're trying to develop, and hope we can go and do likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very